I want to start with why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I got frustrated by, on the one hand, people being completely unethical and doing things with governance that none of us could ever imagine that leaders would do. And on the other hand, I got very upset at the arrogance and violence of those who think they are right on all sides of the spectrum. And somehow we've gotten into a stage where if you say something wrong, if you appear in the wrong picture, if you posted something 20 years ago, if you said something 10 years ago, if you said something 10 minutes ago, you can blow up your career, you can blow up your reputation, you can be just absolutely destroyed. And that is a situation that makes it very hard to have open debates in universities. That's a situation that makes it very hard to discuss anything at work. It's a situation that makes it very hard for two people who disagree to sit in the same room. So that's the reason for this book. And it took me about 6 years to write. So, you know, it finally got there. And I know you don't traditionally share slides. I'm going to share a couple of slides just as sort of a short introduction. And then what I'd like to do is, rather than answer questions, I'd like us all to have a discussion. So Alan, you can see that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's start with a question for all of you, right? In the past, you know, few years, how many of you have felt frustration, indignation, dread, rage, fury, and above all, fear? And of course, I'm talking about the years before coronavirus appeared. And so we've been living in the state of tension, partly driven by politics, but partly driven because it's so damn dangerous to have a debate. It's so dangerous to have a discussion. It's so dangerous to post anything or say anything. And part of what's happened with technology is something similar to what happened with the machine gun in World War I. So if you think of what the machine gun did to warfare, it basically put everybody into trenches. So there were no more open battlefields. There was no more, you run over here, you run over there, you confront this way, that way. What ended up happening is you were either in the British-French trench or you were in the German trench. And there was no in between. And if you tried to leave the trench, then you entered no man's land and you were killed. So you had to stay in the trench, and that was the only place where you could sit. And of course, if you left the trench in the other direction, then you were considered a deserter and you were shot. So there was no option but the trench. There was no movement outside of the trench, and that was it. And in a sense, what technology has done to all of us in recent times is it's put us back into these trenches. So especially in a polarized country like the United States or Great Britain, where you've ended up is you're either on the left-hand side of this or you're on the right-hand side of this. And if you try and cross into no man's land here, they will shoot you, and they will shoot to kill. And they'll shoot you with tweets, or they'll shoot you with Facebook posts, or they'll shoot you with Fox News, or they'll shoot you with MSNBC, or Instagram or whatever. They will just take you out. And so as a result, there is no man's land. And people have taken the position, I know right and wrong. And I am right. And as soon as you take the position, I am right, then you're inside a trench. And there's no movement from that trench. There's no discussion. There's no tolerance. There's no evolution. There's no learning. And there's certainly no humor at all. So the other weird thing that's happened is not only do you fear the other side, sometimes you fear those inside your own trench and tribe. It's not just that they're shooting at you across no man's land. It's that sometimes if you say something wrong, if you dare utter a word that's out of place, if you don't call somebody by the right name, if you don't instantly understand somebody else's position on whatever topic, sex or politics or wages or whatever you want to talk about, you will be declared a heretic and burned. And often you will be burned by your own tribe. And so we've had cases where people like Nicholas Christakis get spit on by his students because his wife dared send an email saying, "You're adults, you can wear any Halloween costume you want." And as you're thinking about that, what these trench warfare has forced people to do is to pick a side. So at least in the United States today, there are two kinds of lawn signs that you see. And one sign says Black Lives Matter, and the other sign says we stand behind the police, the thin blue line. And when you're thinking about that, you do not see lawns that say Black Lives Matter and we support the police. But the interesting thing on this is that when you actually ask people, 2/3 of people support Black lives and 2/3 of people support the police. And so there's this great big center that is being divided by having to pick a trench. And you just don't see that center having a space to have a discussion or to say this makes sense and that makes sense. When you do see a space that attempts to create or enter this no man's land, it gets really interesting. So this is an ad by the two candidates for the governorship of Utah. And they come out and they say, I'm so-and-so, I want to be governor. I'm so-and-so, I want to be governor. We hope you vote for me. We hope you vote for me. But regardless of who wins or loses, we're going to support Utah and we're behind the United States. And again, that's a position that is coming out of today's trenches into a very different kind of political advertisement. And this thing got 2.8 million views in less than 24 hours. Because there is this great big center that doesn't want to sit in the trenches. Let's assume for a second that you're right, and your trench and your tribe and your cause is the one just, correct cause. Let's assume that you are so correct that you are like Mother Teresa, so you're always right. Even here, you want to be careful when you assert that you are right. And the reason why you want to do that is because you have to consider the possibility that right and wrong changes over time. So even if you are right today, you may be wrong tomorrow. And maybe what's okay today may be wrong tomorrow. And that's a really interesting concept to understand, a really important concept to understand, because you've seen this happen time and again. It was true for the longest time that you sacrificed human beings because otherwise the sun wouldn't rise. And, it was considered legitimate, it was considered legal, it was considered essential to kill human beings because otherwise you wouldn't get rain or you wouldn't get sun. And we've done away with that right. It used to be common and natural and, in fact, Saturday's entertainment to execute people in the public squares or to whip them or to behead them. And again, that was considered right. It was considered part of the legal order. It was considered entertainment. And I think very few of us on this call would agree with this being a practice that was right in retrospect, or that we should continue today. this person, right? You can have all kinds of arguments about this person. You can say, this is a person who is too liberal, this is a person who's too conservative, this is a person who's too Catholic, whatever you want to say. What you can't say about this person is that he doesn't spend an inordinate amount of time, more than any one of us, thinking about ethics and thinking about right and wrong. And so this is a person who is right in the center of really thinking about what is the right thing to do. And what's fascinating is that as cardinal in June of 2010, when asked about marriage equality, marriage between the same sex, he came out very clearly and said this is a destructive attempt towards God's plan. 3 years later, he comes out with this statement, who am I to judge? So within 3 years, you see almost a 180-degree flip on this, and you see a similar flip in society. So at least in the United States, 2/3 was against gay marriage in 1997, and by 2017, it's flipped in the other direction. And so this is a really interesting phenomenon because by 2017, what you were taught right and wrong for a majority of people in 1997 has flipped to such an extent that if you held a position, I am against gay marriage, I will not bake a cake for somebody, I will not officiate a wedding for somebody, you were considered a bigot, you were considered somebody to be ostracized, your business should be shut down, you should be boycotted, and you should be destroyed by social media. And so you can hold a position that appears to be right in the majority, and the majority may completely flip on you. In fact, in the last week, it's flipped so completely for Pope Francis that he's now come out in support of same-sex civil unions. So when you think about right and wrong, and when you think about technology and how technology changes right from wrong, one of the questions you might ask is, will my opinion of right and wrong ever change? And when you think about it in terms of sex reproduction, imagine explaining to your grandparents, back when they were young, if you had a time machine, that you now have this pill and that you could have sex and never had a baby. Imagine explaining to them that two bodies never have to come together to conceive a child. Imagine explaining to them that you can now pay a surrogate mother, that you can freeze eggs, you can freeze sperm, and therefore that you can have a baby in not 9 months, but 9 years. So these three simple things have decoupled the act from the consequence, physical contact from conception, and sex from time. And if you'd asked your grandparents, do you think any of these are right? They would have told you, hell no, this is absolutely wrong. We should never, ever permit this. And again, the majority opinion has flipped 180 degrees on all of these. So when you think about how you judge today's technologies and what should be allowed or not allowed, do we permit this research to go forward? Do we permit this procedure to go forward? Think about what your grandkids are going to say about sex and reproduction when they're judging you and they're 70 years old. And so as this stuff progresses, the first artificial uterus was patented in 1955, but it took until a year ago to be able to bring an animal to term outside the body. And there's a certain yuck factor to this photograph, right? I mean, a lot of us look at this photograph and say, oh, I really don't like that. But the interesting question here is, what would that look like if there was a human inside it? And what would it change? And by the way, that ups the yuck factor substantially. On the other hand, you could have babies born to same-sex couples and brought to term by same-sex couples. On the other hand, you could have a discussion with your grandkids that says, do you know that my parents were so primitive that they would go mountain biking or they would go to dangerous countries and not leave the baby at home in a nice protected environment? They would actually carry the baby in their bodies and expose them to all these things. And then a third thing that might change is once you have an embryo external, then the temptation to intervene in that embryo and the ease of intervening in that embryo increases by orders of magnitude. And because that is true, you could have conversations where things like CRISPR are no longer scandals because you were editing babies. They suddenly become 180-degree shifts. Do you realize that my parents were so primitive, so backwards, so superstitious that they didn't edit out the KRAS gene, they didn't edit out the BRCA gene, they didn't edit out the P53 gene. So I've now got cancer because my backwards superstitious parents didn't do gene editing on me. And you can see a 180-degree shift in a generation or two along the concept of, do you edit babies? And why do you edit babies? The traditional view of how ethics evolves and how ethics comes to be and how you discover new ethical precepts are that you have this discussion between religion, philosophy, morals, lawyers. And the argument that I'm trying to put out there is that technology impacts ethics. Technology can impact ethics faster than religions do, and that new technologies sometimes displace old religions. So when you go to an archaeology museum, when you go to an art museum, most of what you're seeing is dead gods. So here are big statues, here are big stelae, here are portraits of gods that died. So this was the sun god, this was Quetzalcoatl, this was the god of rain, this was Zeus, this was Neptune, this was Ram, this was X, Y, Z. You're mostly looking at old gods because 99% of religions have gone extinct. And when you think about why religions spread, when they spread really quickly, one of the fastest spreading religions in history was Islam. And Islam began to spread right after the Justinian plague. And in the space of a very short decades, it suddenly became a dominant religion in big chunks of the world. A part of that had to do with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, of their bureaucracy, of their lack of efficiency, of new weaponry, all true. But it also had to do with this plague. And so imagine two different flocks of people praying for God's protection. And there's one group over here that says, never bathe, and if you bathe, bathe twice a year. And there's this new group that's begging for God's protection from the plague that's saying, hey, you must pray 5 times a day. And every time you pray, you must wash your feet, your hands, your face. So on average, guess what happens to a group of followers that during a plague year does not follow basic hygiene, and this other group of people that practices a great deal of hygiene? And guess who God is going to protect on average? You can take the most horrific of human practices, practice that lasted for millennia and took place not just in the United States South, but took place in India, in China, in Africa, in Greece, in every country, which was enslaving or putting people in indentured servitude or having serfdom or having people subjugated in various ways in various structures. The US South was particularly horrific in this because of the hereditary aspect of it, because of the cruelty of it. But Slavery and subjugation of human beings is a practice that has lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. This is not a new practice, and it is broad spread across cultures. Why did this thing go away as something that was considered okay by the majority in a few short decades, and why did it go away globally? That's not saying there is no current slavery. That's not saying there are no horrific practices today, but the majority approval, legitimacy, support for subjugating other human beings went away in a relatively short period of time as something to legitimately do. Part of the reason is, for the longest time, it was almost impossible to increase human labor. So the only way you had of building additional wealth, the only way you had of making a richer kingdom if you were the king, is to have more subjects and to get more work out of those subjects. One of the few ways you had of augmenting human work was to add a horse, which adds about 4 to 7 equivalent humans. The impact of this on the world GDP is that there was almost no increase in global wealth for 2,000 years. In fact, for tens of thousands of years, because you had basically one human being power plus maybe a horse and an oxen. And so overall economic productivity just did not increase. But then you reached a point where you started using oil, where you started concentrating energy. And this is where I think one of the breakpoints of slavery comes. So you did have great abolitionists, you did have Harriet Beecher Stowe, you did have Harriet Tubman, you did have a whole series of people speaking out against this horrendous practice, which is, I want to emphasize, absolutely wrong. There is no ambiguity on that. But it was wrong, and it lasted for tens of thousands of years. And so why did it go away in a few short decades? And part of it has to do with when you start using oil, every barrel of oil you use contains 10 years of a human being's labor. And when you tie that to thousands of horsepower, then all of a sudden you can get a great deal done without having to subjugate thousands. Let me put this in people terms. Think about the old Viking ships. So there would be some big guy up in the front beating on the drum, and there'd be rows and rows of people manacled to oars down below that had to pull on the oar every time the drum beat. So you were subjugating people to move rulers, to move goods, to transport armies. A single jet engine basically is doing the work of 160,000 of those rowers. So that's how much energy is coming out of this thing. And so what that means is that when you fly from Sweden to New York, you've basically got 320,000 people rowing you across the Atlantic for 6 hours. That's the kind of power you're concentrating in 2 jet engines. And so 2 things happen here. When you stop enslaving people, life expectancy goes through the roof. So life expectancy for the longest period of time was between 20 and 30 years. And all of a sudden, everywhere, life expectancy suddenly starts going through the roof because you can make more, you can give people more, and you don't have to work them to death. The second thing that happens is world GDP goes absolutely through the roof. So all of a sudden we end up with a world that has tremendous amount of wealth. And so the point that I'm trying to get here is that the ethics of what we allow ourselves to do, of what we tolerate, fundamentally change as you introduce new technology. The point which is really important to understand is if you agree that technology can change ethics, not is the only driver of ethics, not is always driving ethics in the right direction, but if you assume technology does change ethics, Technology is becoming exponential. Technology changes ethics, and ethics may begin to change at exponential rates, which means our concept of what's right and what's wrong, of what should be tolerated, what shouldn't be tolerated, can begin to change really quickly. And if you take the position, I am right, I don't need to listen to anybody or anything, you may end up on the wrong side of history pretty quickly. Take an album cover that looks like this. So this is a rock album cover. And there's all kinds of reasons why people may be critical of this cover. They might say, well, why is there a nun in the window? Why is this a depiction of poverty? Why the trailer park? Why the scantily clad women? There's all kinds of things to analyze from an ethics perspective in this photograph. But probably most people aren't focused on the grill. And the grill may be the single most controversial thing in this photograph in a generation or two. Because the first synthetic meat in 2013 had a hamburger that cost $230,000. 2015, $30. Last week, $9. As synthetic meat becomes faster, better, cheaper, becomes all flavor and no cow, more and more people are going to start consuming synthetic meats that are faster, better, cheaper instead of real meat and real steak. And they're going to begin to question, why are we killing 6 billion animals a year? And once the majority adopts this position, I'm not saying there haven't been leading edge people who are vegans. I'm not saying there aren't a series of people who realize this early. I am saying the majority has not adopted that position yet because there hasn't been a faster, better, cheaper alternative yet. But when there is a faster, better alternative, then the majority is going to flip. And pictures like this are going to look absolutely horrifying. Do you realize that my parents were so savage that when they went to the fanciest restaurant in town, the most expensive restaurant in town, they would walk past pieces of dead animals that were rotting, and that was supposed to entice their hunger? This is not going to look so good in a few years when there's a faster, better, cheaper alternative. So what do we have to do to avoid this trench warfare? What do we have to do to bring back a more civilized discourse where you can actually talk to somebody who thinks differently from you do on campus, where you can take the risk of saying something that might be offensive or use words that may not be agreeable to the other side or to your side? We have to use two words that have almost become obscenities because we just don't use them. And those two words are humility and forgiveness. You do not have a lot of humility in the current politicized discourse on campus, in jobs, in HR, in politics, on media. And you certainly don't have a lot of forgiveness. The reason why you have to bring back these things is because even you may not know right from wrong. And as you're thinking about this, it's especially important for this generation to be a little more humble in judging the past. Because when you judge the past and say, oh, well, they did this, or they did that, or they said this, or they said that, you have to consider that even if you are right, the rules may change in 100 years or 50 years. And that you have been electronically tattooed like no other generation in history. We are going to know more about each of us in 50 years or 100 years than was ever known about the most famous people, the most famous kings, artists, whatever in history. Because Google and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and your credit cards and your phones and your tolls and your friends' tags and PayPal will tell everybody what your social desires were, what your sexual desires were, what your political opinions were, what you bought, what you didn't buy, the words you used, and you too will be judged. So let's judge our ancestors with a little more kindness, and let's hope our descendants do the same.